Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for one final daily dose of Bloomburrow Commander spoilers. So far today, we've made it through 3 Commander Precon decks. We're on to number 4, the last deck of Bloomburrow, and this deck is pretty unique. It's a weird Gruul Raccoon big artifact and enchantment deck that has some pretty sweet cards, which means we should probably jump right into it. Start talking about interesting new Bloomburrow cards. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can snag them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/mtggoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout the day, you should head on over to mtgpreviews.com. And oh yeah, if you want to see any of the deck lists from Bloomburrow Commander, there's a link in the description. Click on it. You'll see them all, the reprints and all that good stuff. Anyway, let's talk one more time about Bloomburrow Commander. Our final Bloomburrow Precon might be the wonkiest of them all, at least in terms of face commanders. It's the Gruul deck built around Bello, Bard of the Brambles. So Bello, very unique commander. It's a 3-mana 3/3 Gruul Raccoon Bard, and it says during your turn, each non-equipment artifact and non-aura enchantment you control with mana value 4 or greater is a 4/4 elemental creature token in addition to its other types, and it has indestructible and haste, and whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. So Bello is just something you usually don't see in Gruul. Gruul is typically the color that's really good at blowing up artifacts and enchantments, not necessarily built around big artifacts and enchantments. So very excited to see what Bello actually does. The rest of the deck kind of plays on this theme a bit. Lots of raccoons, lots of expended big mana stuff. Our backup commander is Wildseer Scourging Maw. So with a 5-mana 6/6 legendary elemental wolf, it has trample, and it says enchantment spells you cast from your hand have cascade. So I really love this commander as well. Just like Bello, it cares about something that Gruul doesn't usually care about, which is enchantments. I was actually looking on EDH Rec, and Gruul is the single worst enchantress color combination in all of Magic. It's the least supported. So it's really cool to see a commander for a color combination in an archetype that just usually doesn't get one. So Wildseer, it's kind of like Yidris or Abaddon, these commanders that cascade a bunch when you cast things from your hand. Wildseer, of course, has the restriction that you gotta play a bunch of enchantments. That's the only thing that's gonna cascade, but we know that cascade is an incredibly powerful mechanic. Every time you cast a spell, you get a second spell, essentially. Very, very strong. So Wildseer, as I mentioned before, I love this card just because it brings Enchantress into a different color combination. If you look at popular Enchantress decks, I think Selesnya, I think Orzhov, maybe Abzan, maybe Bant, but I definitely don't think Gruul. So this is just giving us something brand new, and the support is there to build a sweet Gruul enchantment commander. I guess there's a couple of weird Gruul aura commanders, but they're more about like putting auras on your opponent's creatures. Wildseer's gonna play way different than those. So what do we do with Wildseer? And the answer is, we just play a bunch of enchantments and then some payoffs for casting things from exile. Because if you cascade, the cards you cascade into you get to cast from exile. So stuff like Unstable Amulet, Felden Dread Wolf Herald, maybe Nelfinchi. These are cards that reward you for cascading by giving you copies of things and dealing damage and making wolf tokens. So they work really well in a Wildseer deck. As far as the enchantments in the deck, you can really play whatever you want. The good news is green and red do have some really good enchantments. You get mana doublers and triplers like Virtue of Strength and Nyx Bloom Ancient. You get lots of damage from Fiery Emancipation, and there's a lot of good enchantment creatures in Gruul, which is another direction you could go with Wildseer. You could build a deck that was almost all enchantments if you wanted to, where your creatures were enchantments along with all your other permanents. And then, if you want to get mean, and this might be my favorite way to build Wildseer, but also the way that you probably shouldn't build Wildseer because it's just going to make people real salty, but I would argue that Wildseer might be one of the best chaos commanders or stacks commanders because there's a lot of really chaotic and hateful enchantments in red. Imagine casting a Mana Barbs and cascading into a Blood Moon, or casting a Confusion in the ranks and cascading into a Chaos Moon. There's so much potential there. So again, don't go out and spend all your money on Wildseer Chaos because your playgroup will probably let you play it like one time before they kick you out of the playgroup, but it is a really funny way that you could build the deck and play every once in a while. So Wildseer, I just love how unique this card is. The card itself kind of boring, like cast things and I cascade, but I just love that it brings enchantments into a brand new color combination. We also got a new elemental bird in Pyreswipe Hawk, so a 5-mana 4/4 with flying and haste. When it attacks, it gets plus X+0, where X is the highest mana value among artifacts you control, and then whenever you expend 6, so spend 6 mana in a turn on spells, gain control of target artifact for as long as you control it. So on level 1, Pyreswipe Hawk can get really big. If you have like a 9-mana artifact on the battlefield, this just comes down with haste and smashes someone for 13. So if you're a deck with a lot of expensive artifacts, this might be good enough just as a threat, but then it can do some pretty cool things as you spend your mana and steal your opponent's spells. It's kind of like a Aladdin or a Hellkite Tyrant in that it's a red card that can steal your opponent's artifacts. Its growing ability, kind of like Glintraker, which might be a bad comparison because no one really plays Glintraker, but it has the same pumping ability. So Pyreswipe Hawk, I feel like this works well with the Precon itself, because the goal of the Precon is to play a bunch of expensive artifacts and also enchantments, but mostly artifacts that make mana. So if you're playing like Greenstone Hedrids and Chromatic Quarries and cards like that to make a bunch of mana, you're naturally going to be expending a lot. And one of the tricks of expend that isn't super obvious, because it's not that easy to pull off, but it works on anyone's turn. So if you can spend 6 mana during your turn and then spend 6 mana during your opponent's turn, you can essentially be stealing multiple artifacts each turn cycle with Pyreswipe Hawk, which does seem pretty strong. The problem with Pyreswipe Hawk, I see, is it's kind of like Royal Elemental. Royal Elemental is a very strong creature. It's landfall, steal one of your opponent's creatures for as long as you control it. But it's very hard to play because people are just going to kill it, because people don't really want their creatures stolen. I feel like the same thing will happen with Pyreswipe Hawk. Once it hits the battlefield, your opponents are going to make sure to kill it because no one wants their artifacts stolen. So I almost feel like this is going to be at its best in a deck that can sack artifacts. I don't think you can play this as a card that's going to like steal all your opponent's artifacts forever, because someone's definitely going to kill it. But if you're playing like Slowbad or Pianalar or Imskir, a commander that can sack artifacts, it's pretty sweet that Pyreswipe Hawk can come down, smash in for a huge amount of damage, steal one of your opponent's artifacts, and then if it looks like Pyreswipe Hawk is going to die, well, you can always just sack the artifact anyway to make some mana or get a Thopter or whatever. So Pyreswipe Hawk, not a card for every deck, but if your deck is playing a bunch of big artifacts, it's actually a very aggressive and interesting threat. We also got Trail Tracker Scout. So Trail Tracker Scout, 2-mana 1/3 Raccoon Scout, kind of looks like a Boy Scout almost. Tap to add a mana of any color, and then when you expend 8, so spend your 8th mana on spells in a turn, return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. This card is very intriguing to me. So on one hand, it's a bad mana dork because it costs 2 mana, and it's a bad Eternal Witness because it's super slow and clunky. So it's two bad things, but I wonder if you put those two bad things together, maybe you end up with a good card. It is worth pointing out that expend is repeatable. So once you get going, you can be spending 8 mana every turn if you can, and getting a bunch of stuff back from your graveyard. And I do like that this is a mana dork that's fine on turn 2. It's going to ramp you up to 4 mana on turn 3, and it also does something in the late game. One of the problems with like a Birds of Paradise is if you're on turn 10 in a game of Commander and that's your draw for the turn, you're usually pretty sad about drawing the mana birds. But with Trail Tracker Scout, if you draw on turn 10, you can probably play it, play some other spells, immediately get a permanent back from your graveyard, and kind of get the Eternal Witness value. So I don't know if this is a card that I would play. Actually, I don't know what deck I would play this card in, but I do think it's cute and interesting, and it's not that far away from being good. There's just so many different 2-mana mana dorks that it's really hard for a card like this to fight through the rest of the pack to see play. We also got a new Elemental Bear in Evercoat Ursine. So a 5-mana 6/5 with Trample in Hideaway 3, Hideaway 3. So when it enters the battlefield, look at the top 3 cards of your library, exile 1 face down, the rest go on the bottom in a random order, and do it a second time. And then when it deals combat damage to a player, if there's cards in exile with it, you can cast one of them without paying its mana cost. So Evercoat Ursine, pretty sweet creature. We've only seen one other creature in Magic's history with Hideaway. Normally Hideaway comes on lands or enchantments, some sort of non-creature permanent. The only other creature I could find with Hideaway is Watcher Tomorrows, which is very different. That puts the Hideaway card back into your hand when it leaves the battlefield. Evercoat Ursine has a lot of upside. You can theoretically hide away something huge, hit your opponent with it, cast it for free, and we've seen other Hideaway cards, Windbrisk Heights, Fight Rigging, Shelldock Isle, Collector's Cage, be very, very good threats. So this is a card that has a ceiling of like, you play a 6/5, hide away a Ulamog or a Worldfire, some ridiculously unbeatable card, and just get to cast it for free. Although there is going to be some risk here, right? There's also going to be times when you play this and your first hideaway is like land rampant growth or something, and you're going to be a little bit sad with that. So I wonder if this is a card that's mostly for top deck manipulation decks. I think there's a couple of homes for this. So one is, if you're playing cards like Scroll Rack or Sensei's Divining Top, this card goes way up in value, because then you can make sure that you have something good on the top of your deck before you hide it away, and then all you need is that one attack with Evercoat Ursine to cast that big thing and win the game. So that's one possibility. The other place I like this card is in decks that have commanders that can cheat it into play. So like Henzi Toolbox Tori or Xenagos, they're really good at like blitzing things into play, hasting things into play, and Evercoat Ursine coming out of your hand with haste and just smashing can be a potentially game-winning play. So that's one option. The other option is more like the Hans Eriksson or Tally decks, where you're probably playing Sensei's Divining Top stuff anyway, because your commander kind of wants you to manipulate the top of your deck, and then Evercoat Ursine fits that theme very well too. Next up, we get a ridiculous class enchantment in Alchemist Talent, and this card seems kind of busted in some decks. So it's 4 mana. When it enters, you create 2 tap treasure tokens. Then you can level up for 2 mana. And it says treasures you control have tap, sack it, add 2 mana instead of 1 mana. And then for 5 more mana, you get to level 3. And it says whenever you cast a spell, if mana from a treasure was spent to cast it, this class deals damage equal to the spell's mana value to each opponent. So if you think about what this class is, it's a lot of mana, right? So you play it for 4, although you kind of get 2 of that mana back with the treasures it makes. You could use those treasures to level up the next turn, and then your future treasures will sack for 2 instead of 1, which kind of makes all of this much cheaper than it looks. In a treasure deck, once you get to level 2, you only need to sack 3 treasures, and you'll even have mana left over to get to level 3. And then level 3 is a really, really strong way of closing out the game. So if you think about what this is, it's kind of like Rampacious Dragon. The treasures are tapped, so a little worse, but Rampacious Dragon, you get those 2 treasures, and then you get a Goldspan Dragon ability of making your treasures sack for double mana, and then I couldn't really find a direct comparison for the last mode, but it's kind of like Revel in Riches. It's this treasure payoff that if it sticks on the battlefield and you have a bunch of treasures, will probably just win you the game. It won't win it directly like Revel in Riches, but it will win you the game as you spend your treasure mana on big spells, and your opponents are just going to die. The fact that that hits each opponent every time you cast a spell is wild. That means if you cast a Goldspan Dragon, it's 5 damage to everyone. If you cast a Revel in Riches, that's 5 more damage to everyone. That is going to add up really, really quickly. So, of course, Dockside Extortionist is super busted. That might be enough to make this work almost all by itself if you're a really good Dockside deck, but I think this is mostly a card for treasure decks, and treasures are the #1 most popular theme according to EDH Rec, so it's not like this card is supporting some super fringe theme that no one plays. This is supporting the most popular theme in Commander. So if you're playing Prosper, or Mr. House, or Magda, or Agnes, or Galazeth Prismari, any deck that's about treasures, I think this is kind of just an auto-include. It does everything that you want. It makes your treasures, it doubles the mana of your treasures, which is absurdly powerful, and then it probably just wins you the game as you're casting your spells. So Alchemist Talent, I wouldn't just play it in any deck, but if I'm a treasure deck, this is one of the first cards I'm adding. We also got, speaking of treasures, a cute little raccoon rogue in Prosperous Bandit, and I'm very curious if this card is good. So it's a 2-mana 2/2 with First Strike, and it has Offspring of 1, so you can pay an extra mana, get a 1/1 token copy of it, and he said when this creature deals combat damage to a player, create that many treasure tokens. So Prosperous Bandit, it's kind of like it's wearing a Reaver Cleaver. It's kind of like it's a mini old Gnawbones. Essentially, you get a 3-mana 2/2 that if it gets in combat damage, you make 2 treasure tokens. That's kind of the baseline. So is this card actually good enough? Of course, you get the upsides of Offspring and all that. So I was thinking about it, and I'm really not sure. So if you think about like Wood Elves, you can play a Wood Elves for 3 mana, you get a land, you're +1 mana for the rest of the entire game. If you play a Prosperous Bandit, it doesn't do anything anything, but if you get in a hit with it, you get +2 mana, but it's temporary mana. But in theory, it can snowball and get in again the next turn, or pump its power and get even more damage to make even more treasures. So I feel like this is a card that's kind of a build around. Again, I don't think I would just jam it in any deck as a ramp spell, but in a treasure deck, Prosper. Good and Prosper, I know, the most abused sentence in the history of Magic, but it seems Good and Prosper or Magda if the goal of your deck is to make treasures, and especially if the goal of your deck is to make treasures, and you can also manipulate Prosperous Bandit's power, then I think this card is very worth it. I think it could also work in some equipment decks. That's the other places this seems intriguing. If you're playing an equipment deck, especially one that can give Prosperous Bandit trample, something like Loxodon Warhammer or Shadowsphere, then this card becomes really good. If you put a Loxodon Warhammer on this, and it's a 5-powered first striking trampler, there's a pretty good chance that this is making 5 treasures each turn. And if that starts happening, this is a 3-drop that can win the game pretty much by itself with the amount of mana it generates. So the upside is really, really high, but the floor is also pretty low. There's going to be games where this just dies, or your opponents all have blockers and it never gets in those hits. So very curious what you think of Prosperous Bandit. I'm leaning towards good in specific decks. I don't think I would just jam it in any red deck and think of it as a ramp spell, but if I care about treasures, or I can boost its power and give it trample, then it becomes pretty exciting, because I've seen old Gnawbones do some pretty ridiculous things, and this mini 1-creature old Gnawbones for just 3 mana has a lot of upside. We also got Blightcap Badger. So a 4-mana 3/4 Badger Druid. That's also an adventure. Its adventure side is 3-mana instant. Create 2 1/1 green Saproling tokens. And then its creature side, the 4-mana 3/4 Badger Druid, fungi and saplings you control have tapped out a green mana. In the beginning of your end step, create a 1/1 green Sapling creature token. This card kind of caught me by surprise. I was not expecting Saproling and fungus support in this set, but that's really what this is. This is basically Saproling migration, and then a very bad Tendershoot Dryad. Worth pointing out, Tendershoot Dryad triggers on each upkeep. Blightcap Badger only triggers once each turn cycle on your end step. So Tendershoot Dryad in theory is making 4 tokens every turn cycle, Blightcap Badger only 1, but the ability to make all your Saplings and Fungi tap for mana means this is going to be one of the best cards you can play in a Sapling or Fungus deck, because the whole gimmick of Sapling or Fungus is going really wide. Look at the Myco Tyrant, or Slimefoot the Stowaway, or Namada, or Thelen. The whole idea is you're just going to spew out all these Sapling tokens, and when they're all tapping for mana, like Jaheira style, it's going to make the deck much, much scarier. So Saplings and Fungi are definitely a pretty fringe theme. You don't see them very often. But if you're someone that has a Sapling or Fungus deck, definitely going to want to pick up this card and add it, because it's going to be very, very good in that deck. We also got Thickest in the Thicket, which is apparently some sort of workout contest in Bloomburrow between a raccoon and a mouse. 5-mana enchantment. It says when it enters, put X +1/+1 counters on target creature, where X is that creature's power. So essentially doubles the power of a creature with +1/+1 counters. In the beginning of your end step, draw 2 cards if you control the creature with the highest power or tied for the highest power. So Thickest in the Thicket is basically a very souped up but more expensive Triumph of Ferocity. Triggering end step better than triggering upkeep. Drawing 2 cards better than drawing 1 card. So better in basically every way. Mixed with Soul's Might, essentially, where you double a creature's power in the form of +1/+1 counters. And to me, this card seems absurd in Voltron style green deck. So if you have a commander that has a lot of power, this card seems kind of bonkers. Imagine you're playing Yargle and Mutani, and you play this, and all of a sudden you put 18 +1/+1 counters on it, and you definitely have the biggest creature because it's going to be 36 power. So on your end step, you draw 2 cards. Every turn you have the highest power creature, you draw 2 more cards. Or like Galta. This is a one-shot kill sometimes with Galta. Already 12 power. You double it up to 24 power. That's enough to one-shot commander damage kill, or Thunbreaker of Silence. So I don't know if you can play this in just like a generic green deck. It seems kind of risky. I feel like in a generic green deck that's playing big creatures, I'd probably rather just play Last March of the Ents or Rishkar's Expertise, something that's just going to draw me like 10 cards right now, rather than 2 cards a turn over the course of 10 turns, because the risk is, if you're playing the like slow plan, we're going to try to draw 2 cards a turn for 5 turns instead of 10 cards all at once, you get hit by 1 sweeper or something, and it all kind of falls apart. But in these Voltron style green decks, I feel like this card should be really, really strong. It can add an absurd amount of power to the battlefield, and drawing 2 cards on your end step is also very good. As I mentioned before, the risk risk is just, it's pretty bad against sweepers. That's the biggest downside. If you don't have a creature on the battlefield, this is 5 mana, do literally nothing. You don't draw cards, you don't get counters on anything. So it is a little bit high risk, high reward, or maybe some would say win more, although I don't think win more is a bad thing. I want to win more in Commander, but I think in those Voltron style green decks, it should be really good. We also got Rolling Hemisphere, a 7 mana 4/4 vehicle. It gets +1/+1 for each hamster you control, and whenever it attacks, you create 3 1/1 red hamster creature tokens, and then it deals X damage to any target where X is the number of hamsters you control, and you can crew it for 3. So this is essentially the Hamstery Mirror Battlesphere, kind of like a 3-fold Thunderhawk, these big 7 mana artifacts that make a bunch of tokens, deal a bunch of damage. We've seen both Battlesphere and 3-fold Thunderhawk be pretty good. I think Rolling Hemisphere can be pretty good as well. So the downside of this card is the only hamsters in Magic come from 2 Minskin Boos in this card itself. So it's not like you can build a hamster deck and play this in it and then just be like, I got 10 hamsters on the battlefield, I'm going to attack with my vehicle and burn you out of the game. There's just not enough hamsters to make that work, I guess, unless you play Masquerade Nexus and just turn everything into hamsters. But I think the purpose of this card is to be a vehicle card. I think in a vehicle deck, this seems really strong. It's essentially Mirror Battlesphere, but for vehicles. So if you're playing Greasefang or maybe Sidri, decks that can get this out of the graveyard, can turn it into a creature easily, then I think this card's actually a really nice finisher that actually can snowball very hard. Every turn it attacks, you get more hamsters. Those hamsters deal even more damage. Once you start making hamsters, the hamsters can crew the vehicle for the Rolling Hemisphere. Plus, I mean, the flavor is just absolutely ridiculous. So I really like the card. If you're a Mirror Battlesphere fan and also a vehicle fan, it's probably the card for you. As far as reprints, we get a Porcupine Domri. I'm so bad. Badger? I always say Badger because I don't know what a Badger is, but we get the Imagine Critters version of Domri. Also, some good value reprints in the set. Tendershoot Dryad, Grothama, Greater Good, all over $10. Bootlegger Stash, Lotus Cobra right around $5. So pretty decent value in this deck. Oh yeah, before we go today, we got one other card that I had to mention. So somehow, this was a card that I guess Wizards forgot to give someone earlier in the day. So this was actually in the very first deck we talked about today, the Miss Bumbleflower deck, like the Group Hug deck. But the card is just so unique, I had to mention it. I'm very curious if this is a card that's okay to put in your deck. So Perch Protection, 6 mana instant. Gift an extra turn. You can promise an opponent the gift of an extra turn. If you do take it, they take an extra turn after this one. You get to create 4 2/2 blue bird creature tokens with flying. And then if you promise the gift, you basically T-Pro. All your permanents phase out until your next turn. Your life total can't change. You gain protection from everything. Exile Perch Protection. So no looping it. So how this card is going to play, I feel like is actually very, very strong. So you can take and make 4 2/2 flyers and Teferi's Pro out of the turn, so you don't got to worry about taking damage, and then give most likely whoever has the strongest board state an extra turn, hoping that they kill the rest of the table. Is that a healthy play pattern? I'm actually curious. I don't know. Is this a card that's going to make people salty? I know people get salty about extra turns anyway. I kind of feel like you get an extra turn, arch enemy, I'm going to peace out. Please, wreck the rest of the people not doing as well while I'm T-Pro'd out of this turn. I kind of feel like that card's going to make people angry. On the other hand, the card is incredibly unique and the design is super cool. The idea that you can give someone an extra turn and not take any damage during that turn, it's just like such a cool political card. The other question is it even any good? Like, do you fall too far behind if you give someone else the extra turn, even though you're going to be phased out and not take damage during that turn, your life total is not going to change during that turn, you're still letting that person untap all their lands, draw in extra cards, trigger all their stuff. So maybe it's not even good enough, although it is nice that you're getting 4 2/2 birds. That's actually pretty good value for 6 mana and instant speed. So this card, it doesn't really go in any specific deck. I guess there's a couple commanders we talked about as kind of like gift commanders. So if you're playing a gift commander, it'd be fine. But I'm actually just super curious. Is this card good? And are we even allowed to play it? Or is this just a salty card that everyone's going to want to forget about? So let me know what you think about this one in the comments. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Bloomburrow Commander spoilers for today. So we've seen all 4 decks now. Again, check out the link in the description. Look at all the deck lists. Let me know which one's your favorite. What are you most hyped for? What are you going to build around? Let me know what you're thinking in the comments. Thanks for hanging out this spoiler season, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. And I'll be back in, I guess, about a month with some Duskmorn spoilers. So until then, have an amazing day, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? We can find the other spoiler videos we've done today here and here.